it's a very vibrant place for cognitive neuroscience, and I hope you can all come and visit if you haven't before. So today I'm going to be talking about the research that I've done over the last few years that has really focused on the neurocomputational basis of how and when we help other people. So why am I interested in this work? Well, we know that from things such as climate change to infectious disease and aging populations, that current and future generations face these really great challenges. And the solutions to these challenges have to be in part behavioral. They're going to rely us on making decisions that help other people. And if we think about a very basic definition of what we might call prosocial behaviours, these are simply a decision that we make that has some benefits for another person. These prosocial behaviours are very crucial for maintaining our health and our well-being across the lifespan. However, we know that many prosocial acts are effortful, and we need to be able to learn from our actions as to whether they help or harm others. And what I'm interested in is the neural basis of some of these behaviours, some of the computational mechanisms. And I want to ask, do we have specific neural mechanisms for prosocial behaviour that might be somewhat different or specific to those neural mechanisms that we engage when we're only helping ourselves? And to answer that, my research has really taken this multi-level computational approach to understanding prosocial behaviour. And I think this framework can be very useful because the idea is that if we want to understand a computation, just like David Marr described, we need to understand multiple different levels. So at the first level, we need to understand what the computation is. What goal does the system have? And in this case, it would be prosocial behaviour. The second thing that we need to understand is the algorithm by which we achieve this. And of course, there's going to be lots of different algorithms that are simple, but also algorithms that are very complex. And today I'm going to be focusing on two that I've looked at in my research so far, and that's effort discounting, so how we value doing an action based on the reward that we might get, but changed by the amount of cognitive or physical effort that we have to put in to get it. The second algorithm that I think might be quite important is associative learning. So how we update the value of the choice that we make over time based on the outcome that we receive and how unexpected that outcome is. And then at the final level, we want to understand how these algorithms are implemented, so the how or the physical implementation. And again, the answer to this question is likely to be very complex, but in this talk, I'm going to be focusing on two specific parts of the medial prefrontal cortex. So these are the anterior cingulate gyrus, and this one doesn't want to work, so let's see if the mouse works. So this area 24 here, which is dorsal to the corpus callosum, but ventral to this 32 area that's also often spoken about in decision-making. So it's this area 24AB, and also the subgenuine anterior cingulate cortex, or area 25. And what I want to argue is that when you very precisely compare self-benefiting and other benefiting choices, you might be able to find dissociations with these two brain areas specific for this kind of social decision-making. So in this talk, I will answer 3 questions. So first of all, how willing are we to put in effort to help other people, and how are those algorithms implemented in the brain? I'll then ask, how do we actually learn to help others, and how are those algorithms implemented in the brain? And finally, I'll talk about a bit of current research that we've done in the lab, where we've really focused on taking a more ecological approach to understanding prosocial behaviour. And I'll ask whether there's ecological or environmental influences on decisions of when we decide to act to help, and whether that's similar to the kind of choices we make that help ourselves. So starting with the first question, I thought what we do to get everyone in a prosocial mood would be to play a dictator game together. So you might have heard of the dictator game before, you might not, but it's very simple, and it's an economic game that's been used very frequently, apparently to measure prosocial behaviour. So I want each of you in the audience to imagine that I've given you £10, and you have a very simple decision to make. You can choose to keep all of this money for yourself, or you can choose to give some of it away to an anonymous other person. You're never going to meet this other person. They won't know that you've made this choice for them, And your choice is completely anonymous, except for obviously people around you are going to see if you raise your hands, but try and not let that influence your choice. Okay? So if I gave you £10, who would give the whole £10 away to another person? Please put up your hand. So you've got a couple of hands. £9, £8, £7. I'm not specifically looking at my lab. £6, £5, very popular. £4, couple of people. £3, £2. It's getting less popular. £1. Very honest, Jamie, I like that. £0. Still relatively popular, but not as much as 5. Very interesting. So now we can look at what happens if we ask 20,000 people the same question and see if you behaved like what this meta-analysis of dictator game behavior has shown. So in fact, you didn't. So if you really get people in a room and other people aren't watching them, what you find is 36% of people will take the £0 option. In this audience, I think only maybe 4 people did that. But in a meta-analysis, it is the most popular option. People are perhaps economically selfish. They would choose to give none of the money away to another person. The second thing that's quite notable is what happens at giveaway exactly half. So that was quite well represented in the audience. In fact, you were all way more pro-social than these people because probably about half of you decided you wanted to give half away to another person. And then after lots of different unpopular options, again, we see this lovely, cute little spike at the end of about 5% of people that would give all the money away. And perhaps that was quite well represented in this audience too. There were a couple of people who said, I wouldn't keep any of the money. I'm happy to give all of it away. So if we take this data, it suggests that perhaps people are economically quite selfish. Generally, there's a lot of variability in behavior, but the most popular option is to kind of give none of the money away. But I think one of the big problems with these dictator game measures of pro-social behavior is that less money for you is more money for the other person. So that might seem obvious, but the two decisions are completely intertwined. So what if it's just that you don't really value money yourself? Is it really that there's a difference in your altruism? Or is it just that, you know, some people are perhaps older, they have more money, they kind of don't value money themselves as much? Is it really that they're caring about the other person? The second issue with some of these economic game measures of pro-social behavior is we know that lots of everyday pro-social acts are effortful. It's not that we simply make a decision to help or not, it's that we have to actually energize our actions to do that helping behavior. So maybe what we need is paradigms that separate the self and the other decisions so that less money for you isn't less or more money for the other person. These decisions are independent. And secondly, that we can manipulate how effortful the pro-social choice is to perhaps get closer to looking at this kind of idea of pure altruism. So that's what we wanted to answer in our first study that I'll present today. So we were interested in how willing people are to put in effort to help another person. And can we use self-benefiting choices as a baseline of motivation? So just looking at whether people are motivated in general. So to do this, we tested 39 young adults, aged 18 to 36. And before they took part in our experiment, we always do this procedure where they meet someone else on the other side of the door. This seems quite weird. They wear a rubber glove, just like depicted in here, a lovely marigold. And it just means that it obscures any information about their age or their gender. But the person who's taking part in the task, so the self person, knows that their decisions will really affect another person. We then got all participants to squeeze a grip force device as hard as they could, and this measured their maximum voluntary contraction, or just how much strength or effort they could put in at their own individual baseline. And we did this study in an MRI scanner as well. And we gave participants this decision-making task. And on each trial, we asked them, do you want to rest, where you'll just get 1 credit, which would be translated into money, but you wouldn't have to put in any effort at all, so you wouldn't have to squeeze this hand grip. Or you could choose the work offer, and that would always be more credits, represented by the number at the bottom of the pie chart, but you'd also have to put in more effort or more maximum voluntary contraction, which was represented by the segments of the pie chart. So you'd make the choice between the two options, rest or work. You'd then actually have to squeeze the script force device with real-time feedback to the specific effort level on the screen, and then you'd get the outcome, whether you got the credits or not. And crucially, sometimes people made these choices for themselves on the self-trials. They chose between rest and work, they put in the effort, and they got the reward. But on the prosocial or other trials, they made the choices, they put in the effort, but this anonymous other person received the reward. And using this paradigm, we could ask these two questions. So first of all, are people equally willing to choose to put in effort to reward themselves and the other person? And secondly, could we identify specific parts of the brain that were engaged in these prosocial, but not these very closely matched self-benefiting acts? So first, looking at the behavior, what we found was this very strong recipient by effort interaction. So people were willing to choose to help the other person, so the other bars are in blue. But what you can see is that as the effort level goes up, people are much less likely to do it. So the gap between self and other really increases as effort gets harder. I think it's important to show that even in this task where you do have to do effort, people are still relatively prosocial. But you can see that the effort cost is also really driving their behavior. So next, we can think about the kind of algorithms that we can borrow from non-social decision-making to really parameterize how people are making these decisions and the kind of shape of their discounting function. So whether effort has a very strong cost over time, or whether, for example, it's a linear effect. And what we find quite consistently is that effort seems to have this parabolic effect that really closely matches the behavior I showed, where as the effort level increases, people are much less likely to want to help the other person. And we also find in this computational modeling that we need these separate K or discounting parameters for self choices and for other choices. So you have a kind of separate parameter that captures how people are making these decisions. So now we have this K parameter that collapses effort and reward very nicely. We can then compare it between other and self. And we see it's expected that people have this higher K parameter for others. So they're much less motivated to help the other person than to help themselves. And we can capture that just in this single number. In subsequent research, we were interested in whether this pattern of behavior is the same across our whole lifespan, because there's some evidence that perhaps older adults might be relatively more prosocial. And that's exactly what we found in this task. So what I'm showing here is another study that we did comparing young and older adults on that exact same task. And what you can see in the older adults is that their parameter for other K is much lower than for young adults. So they're much more motivated than younger adults to put in effort to help others. So they still show this self-other difference, but you can see it's greatly reduced. So that kind of exemplifies how we can then use these computational parameters to closely compare across the lifespan. We can make sure that the cost is effort rather than money. And even in older adults who might have accumulated more wealth, we can use these paradigms to see how prosocially they behave. So going back to the young adults in the imaging study, we were then interested in these specific brain areas. And we leverage representational similarity analysis, which I won't go into in huge detail. But if you're not aware of the technique, it's a multivariate technique, which is very useful for our design, which is very condition rich because we have multiple effort levels, multiple reward levels. So we can build this dissimilarity matrix and ask where in the brain represents effort on the self trials and where represents effort on the social trials. And when we do that, we find that only this one area of the brain in the anterior cingulate gyrus, which I spoke about before, that's shown here in blue, this area carries this multivariate representation of effort, but only on the prosocial trials, and it does not code effort on the self-benefiting trials. So this suggests that we might have a distinct neural representation of prosocial effort in anterior cingulate gyrus. As I mentioned in the task, there's also the point where you're actually energizing the action to help someone else. So we also time lock to that period with a parametric modulator. And again, we see the anterior cingulate gyrus. And again, it seems to just signal the prosocial trials every time people are required to exert effort on them, but not the self-benefiting trials. And if we compare the function of this particular part of the brain across species, that seems to kind of corroborate its role in social behavior. So early work showed that lesions to macaque anterior cingulate gyrus seem to specifically disrupt social behavior and not non-social behavior. And we know that this part of the brain seems to contain single neurons that signal rewards delivered to another person or another monkey, but not rewards delivered to the monkey themselves. So you can see that there's this firing just for other reward, but not for neither reward or self-reward. So we were then lucky enough in our subsequent research to be able to test a sample of human patients that had lesions also covering the anterior cingulate gyrus, because of course we know that fMRI is perhaps correlational, and we could supplement this evidence by taking a causal approach in humans as well. So in this work, co-led with Dr. Joe Cutler, we tested 25 patients who had focal ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions that covered this subgenual anterior cingulate cortex region and the anterior cingulate gyrus. And we tried to match them very closely to age and gender matched controls, and also to patients who had lesions outside of ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So all of these participants completed the same effort-based decision-making task. And now we could ask two further questions. So first of all, does damage to ventromedial prefrontal cortex affect the willingness to put in effort to help others? And secondly, can we use computational lesion mapping to then identify subregions within VMPFC, because we have a relatively large rare sample of patients that code this prosocial and not self-benefiting effort? And first comparing the behavior between the different groups that we studied and focusing on this K parameter that nicely captures how people were making decisions, what we saw was that those patients who had damage to the VMPFC as a whole seemed to show even greater discounting for the other person themselves. So they were relatively less prosocial. The gap between these pairs was enhanced compared to both healthy controls and compared to lesion controls. And now we can take the difference in self and other K and ask, is there a particular part of VMPFC that is showing this atypical behavioral effect? And when we did that, it was not the anterior cingulate gyrus, but instead this part of the brain in the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, where if you had damage here, this difference between self and other was greatly enhanced. So that suggests that this subgenual ACC area is causally involved in prosocial effort. So to summarize that first part, we find that young adults are less willing to put in effort to help another person than themselves, particularly when the effort costs are very high. Older adults might be slightly different in this behavior. In the imaging study, we found that anterior cingulate gyrus seemed to carry this specific representation of prosocial effort. And in lesion work, we showed that it was actually the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex that causally contributed to prosocial and not self-benefiting effort. So the next question we wanted to ask is, okay, so effort seems very important for prosocial behavior, but of course, whenever we make a prosocial choice, we need to learn about the outcome of our decision and whether it really helped the other person or whether it did not. And again, what we can do is we can look to algorithms in other fields. So we can look to algorithms such as reinforcement or associative learning, which give a very nice description of how we learn and update the value of our actions over time when they benefit ourselves. And the key idea in this algorithm that I'm showing here is that the way that we update the value of what we do in the future and our choices is based on a prediction error, so the difference between the outcome we expected and the outcome that we actually got. And that difference is scaled by this learning rate parameter. So that acts exactly like the K parameter that I spoke about before, and we could compare it across different age groups, across different learning conditions and different populations. And this framework isn't just theoretical. We know from seminal work by Wolfram Schultz and colleagues that perhaps dopamine neurons in the ventral tegmental area seem to carry this prediction error-like signal. So they increase their firing rate to unexpectedly positive outcomes, consistent with a positive prediction error. But they also decrease their firing rate when rewards are really likely to happen and unexpectedly don't occur, showing that it's really the unexpectedness of the outcome rather than the outcome itself that's important. And since the seminal work, we've seen in other studies that different parts of the medial prefrontal cortex in humans that also have corresponding areas in non-human primates also carry a prediction error-like signal. So here we wanted to ask, how do we actually learn to benefit others, and can we identify specific brain areas? So in this study now done a few years ago, during my PhD, what we did was we tested 31 young adults. We again used this kind of procedure either side of a door, and again, this was done during neuroimaging. And this time, participants were asked to do this prosocial learning task. So it had 3 different conditions. At the beginning of the trial, they were told who they were playing for, whether it was themselves, where they would get all the money for themselves, whether it was the other condition where they were learning to benefit this other person anonymously outside of the scanner, where any money they received would be given to that person. Or because it was learning, we could also include this interesting control condition where we told people, in this condition, you're learning for no one. Neither of you will get the reward. You're just going to see the points on the screen, but it won't be translated into any money. And that was important to try and make sure that our non-social condition also wasn't just a kind of not me condition. So we could even more stringently compare the neural signals between all 3 conditions here. And we wanted to ask, first of all, do people learn at different rates when they're trying to benefit themselves, another person, or no one? And secondly, can we identify those specific brain areas that are involved in prosocial and not self-benefiting or even no one learning? And looking at the behavior, comparing the learning rates in the 3 different conditions, what we saw was that people seem to have a higher learning rate for their own reward outcomes, so the blue bar here, compared to when they were learning to benefit the other person or no one. And because we were doing MRI at the same time, what we could do was we could calculate the size of the prediction error from our computational model whenever people got an outcome across many, many trials. And we could correlate the size of that prediction error with neural responses that we observed. And when we did that, we saw, again, this subgenuine anterior cingulate cortex area seemed to code this prosocial prediction error response. So it changed its bold response up and down, trial by trial, with the size of the prediction error, but only when you were helping another person. And it did not respond to no one or self. And because this is parametric fMRI, we can take the baseline as important. So this suggests that the subgenuine anterior cingulate cortex is perhaps very critical for prosocial learning. But again, the study was fMRI, so more recently we were interested in, again, using our patient population to see whether this part of the brain was causally involved in learning to help others. And this is work led by a PhD student in our group, Margot. So all of the patients and matched controls completed this prosocial learning task. We then asked whether damage to the whole ventromedial prefrontal cortex area changed how people learn. And there's quite a lot of evidence that VMPFC is involved in reinforcement learning. So we were interested to see if we could still pull apart the self-other difference. And secondly, can we then use lesion mapping again to actually look at the parts of VMPFC that might contribute to any of the behavioral differences that we saw? So first, comparing just the accuracy by which people learn in the different conditions, we saw that the VMPFC patient group seemed to be less accurate, particularly when they were learning to help another person than no one. And this pattern was highly atypical because we can see in healthy controls that generally people treat other and no one quite similarly. Their accuracy is kind of comparable, and that's the same in the lesion controls. Whereas those patients who had a VMPFC lesion seem to be atypically worse at learning for another person compared to even when no one received the outcome. We did also see that VMPFC damage led to a self-benefiting impairment. So in healthy populations, what we see is that people are also more correct for self than no one. People kind of prioritize rewards for themselves compared to when neither person gets the reward. And we saw that normal pattern in these healthy controls and in the lesion controls. But if we looked at the VMPFC patients, that kind of self-benefiting bias completely went away. They treated self and no one the same. So then we can take these behavioral patterns and some computational parameters that we can fit for a reinforcement learning model, and we can then put them onto the brain with lesion mapping and ask whether we can find these more small areas within VMPFC. So when we look at the coding of prediction errors for other compared to no one, what we find is that in the modeling, that's also atypical in the VMPFC patients. And that impairment specifically correlates with the same portion of the subgenual ACC that we saw in the imaging study. And when we look at negative prediction errors, so this is when unexpectedly bad outcomes happen, again, we see that this correlates with subgenual ACC, but now also this anterior cingulate gyrus region. So that suggests patients who specifically have damage in these smaller parts of VMPFC have an atypical learning pattern when negative prediction errors affect another person. So to summarize that, what we found was that people learn at a slower rate to reward other people compared to themselves. We find that in prosocial learning, it's the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex region that seems to track these prediction errors, specifically when they affect another person. And finally, in this task, we find it's both the subgenual ACC and the anterior cingulate gyrus damage that disrupts prosocial learning. So again, these two smaller parts of the medial prefrontal cortex, but damage in these areas does not affect self-learning. So I'm just going to end very shortly by showing a new study that we've done in the lab where we're taking some of these approaches and trying to apply them within an ecological framework. So why do we think that that's important? Well, we know that in everyday life, we're not always picking between kind of two options, so between apples and oranges or two different stimuli that have different probabilities of reward. Instead, what we're doing is we're deciding whether to interrupt our ongoing behaviours for alternatives. So are you going to listen to this talk or will you check your phone at any moment in time? It's not really two different choices that are presented in front of you, is how you track your ongoing behaviours. And in collaboration with Todd Vogel, we've been interested in how we can apply some of these ideas to think about prosocial behaviour. So when do people stop to act to help others, considering all of the other things that they could also be doing to be helpful in the environment? And again, we already have a very good framework for this. So behavioral ecologists have been speaking for some time about how the context of the environment affects decisions to act. So for example, this leopard, when it decides to go and take this buffalo, will depend on how many buffalo are available. So is the environment very rich with buffalo or is it very sparse with buffalo? And what they've shown is that in poor environments, animals are more likely to act because they know that those opportunities are better than the alternatives that are available. Whereas in rich environments, perhaps animals are more choosy about what actions they do. We also know from parallel research in social psychology that there's been some controversial evidence that perhaps poorer people are more generous. So again, this idea that perhaps people in poor environments might be paradoxically more prosocial, but most of this evidence is questionnaire-based or correlational. So here we wanted to ask, does when we decide to act to help depend on the environment? So what we did was we asked people to watch a movie, and I'll give you the example of that. It was David Attenborough, because everyone likes to watch David Attenborough. And while they watched this kind of Blue Planet video, they encountered opportunities to stop the video, skip some of the video, and act, either to help themselves or to help another person. And we manipulated the context in which people made these decisions. So what I'm showing here on this graph is whether the opportunities they encountered were in a poor environment, where generally opportunities were lower in probability and lower in magnitude of reward, or in a rich environment, where generally the opportunities that they got were higher in probability or higher in reward. We signaled this using these kind of oval shapes here, and how filled in they were showed the probability of reward, and the color of them showed the magnitude. So at any time, participants could press spacebar to accept an opportunity. If they did that, the video skipped. They had to do a fixed effort task, because as we know, when you're trying to help someone, it often requires effort, but it was always the same level. And then they saw the outcome. Or they just continue watching the movie. So I'll give you an example of what that looks like.
The surface of the ocean conceals the many creatures that live beneath.
So they've stopped the video. You can see it completely skips because they're not watching it anymore, and they do. And that's why they did that one. Yeah. So that's an example of what the participants saw. It's always easier to show that. Okay, so first we were interested, are people going to be pro-social at all? Who's going to stop watching a movie that they've kind of rated as enjoyable to help someone else? And what we found was that people were still surprisingly pro-social. It's not just that in these tasks where we show them a grey screen, they're like, it's boring, I might as well be helpful. Even in this video condition, almost 50% of the time they interrupted the video to potentially help another person, even if it was probabilistic. Of course, they did so more for themselves, which is what we always see. The second really interesting thing we saw was that the environment did have an effect. And in the way that we predict that animal behavior works, so non-human animal behavior, for the same opportunities, people were more likely to stop the video in a poor environment, where generally they were of lower quality, than in a rich environment. So now we could see whether this interacted, these two different effects. And just to note that all of these effects were replicated in 3 different studies in the lab and online. So what we saw, again, fitting our model, which I don't have time to go into, was that humans were much more likely to stop to help others in a poor environment compared to a rich environment. And that effect was stronger than self-benefiting decisions. So this ecological effect seems to be more strong when you're making these social decisions than when you're making self-benefiting decisions. And in this model, this is captured by this O parameter. So you can see the gap between poor and rich for other is greater than the gap between poor and rich for self. Because we've got a computational model, we can also look at this temperature parameter, or how noisy people are. And this was very interesting, because when we compared that parameter, what we saw was that people became equally sensitive to value for the self-rich environment and the other poor environment. So these 2 conditions here. So you always find that people prefer self, but when we look at sensitivity to value, it even increased to the same level as the self condition in a pro-social condition when put in this ecological framework. Okay, so to finish all of that, what I've shown today is that if we go back to our multi-level framework, that pro-social effort is less accepted than self-benefiting effort. Pro-social learning is slower than self-benefiting learning. And perhaps we can use these computational models to help us understand differences between conditions across the lifespan and in the brain. I suggested that we can use some of these same algorithms that we do for self-benefiting behavior as we do for pro-social behavior, and perhaps we really do use similar ones. And finally, I've argued that we might be able to identify specific parts of the medial prefrontal cortex that are necessary for pro-social effort and pro-social learning. whereas other areas of the medial prefrontal cortex might do both self and other. And the next steps for the lab are to take this multi-level approach to think about how we can really take it into a more ecological framework, how we can understand how it changes across adolescent development, and also in those adolescents who experience high levels of antisocial behaviour in conduct disorder. And I hope to be able to share that with you in the future. So I'd like to thank, of course, the many people who did most of this work, my lovely lab in this photo. Many of them are in the audience and have posters, so do please go and look at those. Of course, the funders of the research, and to Jamie and BACN for this wonderful award, which I'm absolutely thrilled to receive. Thank you.